The story begins not with a homecoming, but with an absence. Months of sand, sun, and unrelenting schedules had blurred together into a single long tour of duty. The protagonist, a quiet yet meticulous service member, had spent every hour thinking about the small piece of land back home, a rectangle of green on the edge of a growing subdivision. It was more than dirt and grass. It was a promise, a future, and the anchor to everything familiar. In his mind, he could see it as clearly as a map, the oak at the back corner, the gravel drive curling toward a modest but well-kept bungalow, and the mailbox he had painted before leaving. What he didn't know was that while he was thousands of miles away, paperwork and whispers were weaving a new story over his property. Homeowners association meetings, full of quiet grumbles and power plays, had turned their gaze on his land. Without his presence, the plot became a tempting prize, an empty space to be claimed, paved, and folded into their master-planned community. They believed distance meant weakness. They believed service meant distraction. They believed wrong. As the deployment neared its end, he thought only of going back to something solid and unchanging. He pictured driving up the road that led to his house, windows rolled down, feeling the scent of cut grass and rain. He pictured the key turning in the lock, the creak of familiar hinges. He pictured neighbors waving, perhaps asking polite questions about his time away. All of it wrapped together into a single sense of home, the word he had clung to like a lifeline. The plane touched down at dawn. The sky over the airport was a soft, pale blue, and every breath of home air felt heavier, sweeter. Bags were gathered, paperwork signed, and then he was driving. First along highways, then smaller roads, then finally the narrow lanes lined with mailboxes and half-built houses. The subdivision had grown in his absence. Where there had been open fields were now fences and ornamental streetlights. The houses looked similar, beige and boxy. But his land, he thought, was set apart, outside the HOA's reach, protected by deeds older than the community itself. He turned the last corner expecting the same gravel drive and oak tree. Instead, he found a barricade of orange cones, fresh pavement poured across his boundary, and a sign hammered into the ground that made his pulse stop. Welcome to Willow Creek Phase 3rd. New lots available. His oak tree was gone. The gravel drive was gone. In their place sat a row of foundation stakes and a portable office trailer emblazoned with the HOA's logo. For a long time, he just sat there with the engine running, the weight of the scene pressing down like a lead blanket. At first, he thought he had made a wrong turn. Then he thought it was some temporary construction. Then slowly the realization formed. They had taken it. Not just trespassed, taken. Later, documents would reveal the layers of their scheme. Quiet votes in meetings he was never notified of, back-channel negotiations with a developer, a delinquent dues claim invented to create the appearance of default. They had declared his absence abandonment. They had sold the land under a legal fiction. And while he was patrolling overseas, his mailbox, his gravel, his oak tree, all had been swallowed by the HOA's expansion plan. He pulled over at a vacant curb and got out, walking up to what had been his boundary line. Fresh gravel crunched under boots, still dusty from deployment. A clipboard-holding man emerged from the trailer, glancing up, but said nothing. There were stakes in the ground, white paint lines, and a bulldozer idling. Everything about it screamed permanence. The smell of cut wood and asphalt was thick in the air. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just looked. Years in uniform had taught him that the first weapon is information. Quietly, he walked the perimeter, noting license plates, company names on the machinery, taking photos with his phone. Each picture felt like a small act of reclamation, proof that he wasn't imagining it, that he had not disappeared. Inside, anger churned, but above it was a colder, clearer current. This wasn't going to be solved with a heated conversation at an HOA meeting. This wasn't about a fine or a fence. This was theft, executed under the cover of bureaucracy, and it would be answered accordingly. He spent the rest of the day driving to county offices. The clerk's counter smelled of coffee and old paper. File after file confirmed what he feared. The property had been transferred, signatures had been filed, and notices had been sent to an address he no longer used. The HOA's legal counsel had moved swiftly. They had underestimated only one thing: his ability to fight back. That night he stayed in a motel off the highway. The glow of the television flickered across his uniform as he spread out documents on the bedspread. Each paper was a piece of the puzzle: deed history, HOA bylaws, county zoning codes. His phone buzzed with messages from fellow service members welcoming him home. He typed brief replies but told no one what he was facing. This was his battle, and he would plan it alone. Outside, rain began to fall, a steady patter against the window. He thought of the oak tree cut down without ceremony. He thought of the HOA board smiling across polished tables as they voted. He thought of the years he had spent defending property and principle far from home, only to return and find his own violated. The irony was almost unbearable. Yet under the frustration, something stronger took root: a sense of mission. By midnight, a plan had begun to form. Not the details yet, but the outline of a counterstrike that would be precise, lawful, and devastating. They had treated him as an absent owner. They had forgotten he was more than that. He was an active service member with access to resources they couldn't imagine. And the next move would not be made in a county office, but on a scale big enough to match their arrogance. The following morning, he drove back to the edge of the subdivision. The bulldozer was already moving, scraping the ground where his living room had once stood. Children rode bicycles nearby, oblivious. The HOA banner fluttered on a temporary fence. He stood at the curb, raincoat hood up, and watched for a long moment. In that stillness, he let the loss settle fully. Only then, with that clarity, did he turn away and head for the nearest base. Within the gates of the installation, life moved with military precision. Trucks rolled, flags snapped, voices carried. Here, at least, there was order. He checked in with an old contact in logistics under the guise of routine paperwork. Nothing overt. Nothing that would reveal his intentions. Step by step, he began assembling information on what could be done when civilian property intersects with federal interests. There were programs, precedents, and channels obscure enough to slip beneath the radar of an HOA board. Weeks passed. On the surface, he was just another returning service member settling back into routine. Beneath the surface, he was drawing lines on maps, matching them with zoning overlays, and building a case not just for restitution, but for repossession. The HOA had overreached. He would respond not with a lawyer's letter, but with an operation. By the time autumn leaves began to turn, the plan had taken shape. It would not be impulsive. It would not be reckless. It would be methodical, undeniable, and entirely within the bounds of the law. The same discipline that had carried him through deployments would now guide him through this new theater of action. The day he received the final piece of confirmation, a federal directive related to the land's original designation, he sat in his truck and closed his eyes. The subdivision outside the window bustled with children, delivery vans, and manicured lawns. They had no idea what was coming. As the sun set behind rows of identical houses, he drove away, the documents secure in a locked briefcase. Chapter 1. Of his homecoming had ended not with a welcome, but with a declaration of war, quiet, calculated, and inevitable. He left the subdivision behind, but it stayed in his head like a bad frequency. Every straight-edged street, every manicured lawn felt like a line in an enemy grid. At the base, he blended back into routine, logging hours, attending briefings, moving through the day as if nothing unusual had happened. Only when the door of his quarters closed at night did the real work begin. Maps, deeds, military records, and historical designations spread across his desk. The more he dug, the more he realized the HOA had built its expansion on a foundation of assumptions. They assumed the parcel they'd taken was just another empty lot. They assumed the owner was gone, or at least powerless. They assumed no one would notice a tiny footnote in a decades-old federal file. But he noticed. The land had been part of a training easement during the Cold War. It still carried a dormant federal interest that had never been formally released. That interest gave him leverage far greater than any lawyer's letter. During the day, he cultivated relationships. Over coffee in the logistics office, he spoke with a civilian contractor about equipment allocations. In the motor pool, he helped a junior officer troubleshoot a convoy schedule. At the legal desk, he asked hypothetical questions about property with dual designations. Each conversation gave him another thread. None of it was overt. It was reconnaissance, like moving silently through unfamiliar terrain. Meanwhile, the HOA plowed ahead. Bulldozers cut deep into what had been his yard, regrading it into lots. Marketing banners went up. Phase 3 now selling. On social media, the board chair posted smiling photos of ribbon cuttings. They had no idea their victory was already under review in federal offices. Weeks turned into a careful rhythm. Documents went out under official letterhead. Inquiries were filed with county clerks. A title examiner from a regional office flagged the discrepancy he had found. A base attorney confirmed the old easement still held force. All of it was quiet, procedural, invisible to the people on Willow Creek's HOA board. At night, he walked the perimeter roads of the base, thinking. The desert wind from his deployment still seemed to cling to him, a reminder of patience. This wasn't going to be a dramatic confrontation in a meeting hall. It was going to be a legal and logistical encirclement. The more they built, the more evidence he had of encroachment on federally encumbered land. Then, one morning in early winter, a single envelope arrived at his on-base mailbox. Inside was a copy of a memorandum stamped with a federal seal. The dormant interest in his land had been reactivated pending review. It was the first green light. He didn't celebrate. He simply folded the paper and locked it away. The next phase would require precision. He began drafting a formal notice of trespass, not to the HOA board, but to the developer's bonding company. He lined up a surveyor to mark the original boundaries under federal supervision. He reviewed logistics on moving small units of equipment for training purposes onto land under dispute. All of it entirely lawful. All of it devastating once in motion. The irony wasn't lost on him. While the HOA imagined they were expanding their domain, they were, in fact, building on ground the federal government could reclaim with a single order, and he would be there when it happened. By mid-December, the case file was thick enough to speak for itself. The base legal office forwarded it up the chain. A week later, a meeting was scheduled at a regional command. In a windowless conference room, he laid out the maps, photographs, and documents. Officers and attorneys listened, brows furrowed. When he finished, one of them simply nodded and said, "We'll take it from here." Walking back to his truck, he felt a cold wind cut across the parking lot. For the first time since his return, the anger eased slightly. This was no longer a personal grievance. It was a matter of federal interest. The wheels were turning. Back in the subdivision, the HOA still sent him letters addressed to former owner. They still posted notices about delinquent dues on a property they no longer thought he held. He filed each one away. Evidence. Proof of their overreach. On a gray January morning, he drove past the site one more time. The houses were half-framed now, timber skeletons reaching into the air. Children played on piles of dirt. The HOA's banner still flapped, confident. He stayed only a moment, then drove away, a sealed packet on the passenger seat containing the formal notice that would change everything. He had been patient. Now the operation would begin. Spring arrived on Willow Creek with the usual rituals of mowing, planting, and weekend barbecues. But this year there was an unfamiliar undercurrent. Fences had gone up where there were none before. Surveyors with clipboards and hard hats walked in slow, deliberate lines through people's front gardens. Heavy equipment stood idle, not because of weather, but because of orders no one quite understood. The HOA board issued vague statements about a temporary training exercise, but the tone of their newsletters had shifted from smug to strained. In a windowless room on base, the man who had once simply been a homeowner reviewed the latest set of maps. The federal stamp on each page gave them a weight that no HOA meeting minutes could counter. Phase 2 had been authorized, full repossession of the encumbered property. The language was dry. Assertion of federal interest. Removal of unauthorized improvements. But the effect was clear. The subdivision, as the HOA knew it, was about to disappear. At dawn on a cool April morning, the first convoys moved. Not tanks or soldiers with weapons, but trucks, survey crews, and uniformed personnel in high-visibility vests. They arrived under the authority of a training directive and a reactivated easement. By mid-morning, temporary command posts had been set up on vacant lots. Portable barriers extended down the main road. The HOA president emerged again, papers in hand, shouting at anyone who would listen, but the personnel on site had nothing to debate. They had orders signed at a level far above a neighborhood board. Residents woke to find new notices taped to their doors. They were bland and bureaucratic. Advisories about land under federal review, instructions on access protocols, and points of contact for claims. Yet behind the polite language was a reality no one could ignore. The land under their houses was no longer uncontested. Construction halted completely. Deliveries were refused at the fence line. Even the Postal Service rerouted mail to temporary boxes. From his office, the service member received hourly updates. Satellite imagery, drone photos, legal briefings. The HOA's grip was being peeled away layer by layer. He didn't relish the chaos. He simply watched, ensuring each step stayed within the law. This wasn't vengeance by force. It was the restoration of a deed through channels the board had never imagined. Local media arrived, filming from the edge of the fences. Their footage showed neat rows of identical houses standing unfinished, flags of caution tape fluttering in the breeze, and uniformed teams measuring, cataloging, photographing. A suburban standoff, one anchor called it. Neighbors muttered about government overreach. Online comment sections filled with speculation. Through it all, he remained anonymous. The story was framed as a bureaucratic anomaly, not a personal retaliation. Inside the HOA's rented trailer, panic turned into infighting. Minutes from emergency meetings, later leaked, showed board members blaming each other for rushing the land deal, for ignoring the odd line in the deed about federal interest. The developer stopped answering calls. Banks froze financing. Prospective buyers walked away. The subdivision was no longer an investment. It was a liability. By May, the repossession moved from paper to action. Unauthorized structures on the encumbered parcels were dismantled. Materials were trucked off for storage. Crews restored drainage and removed utilities the HOA had installed without permits. The land began to look less like a neighborhood and more like a blank training ground. The oak tree was still gone, but its absence was now part of a cleared field under federal control. The service member drove past only once, late at night. Through the chain link, he saw rows of survey stakes illuminated by portable floodlights. The houses that had sprouted in his absence stood half-framed and empty, ghosts of an ambition undone. He parked for a moment, engine idling, then drove on. The operation was nearly complete. Soon, the property would be formally transferred back under his name, and the HOA would be a cautionary tale. But he also knew the board would not give up easily. They had lawyers, political contacts, and a taste for power. They would file injunctions, lobby county officials, and try to spin the story. The next chapter of his plan would have to address not just the land, but the narrative itself, making sure the truth of what they had done became public record. On base, the following morning, he drafted a final packet of documents. A timeline of the HOA's actions, copies of the fraudulent notices, photographs of the construction, and the federal orders that had undone it all. When the time came, the story would not just be about repossession, but about exposure, a complete record of how a homeowners association had tried to dispossess a service member and lost everything instead. As summer approached, the subdivision grew quieter. Without construction crews or open houses, the streets were empty. The HOA's newsletter stopped arriving. Neighbors whispered of moving away. The board's power had evaporated with its expansion plans. The land was his again, but the fight for accountability had only begun. Standing at the edge of the cleared field one evening, he felt the wind move over the grass like a tide. It smelled different now, not of asphalt and sawdust, but of open earth. He thought of the long nights overseas when he had pictured this place as a sanctuary. It wasn't the same as before. It never would be, but it was back under his care. And that was enough to begin again. The repossession was complete. The reckoning was still ahead. The first hints of resistance arrived not as trucks or barricades, but as envelopes. Certified letters with crisp return addresses began landing at his on-base mailbox and at the temporary postbox he had set up near the subdivision. They carried the tone of authority: cease and desist demands from HOA council, notices of intent to sue, accusations of improper seizure and abuse of power. Each one was placed unopened into a growing file. He had expected this. In fact, he had prepared for it. Across town, the board huddled in rented conference rooms with their attorneys. Meeting notes leaked later showed how the narrative they crafted in those rooms differed from reality. They called themselves victims of government overreach and began contacting local officials, hoping to turn the story into one of a plucky neighborhood standing up to a faceless bureaucracy. But the paperwork told a different tale: deeds with forged signatures, notices sent to old addresses, votes taken without quorum. Every attempt to weaponize public sympathy risked exposing their own misdeeds. Meanwhile, the cleared land sat silent. Federal crews had packed up most of their equipment, leaving only markers and a few small structures. To passing motorists, it looked like a stalled development project. To anyone who had read the orders, it was a training easement, reactivated and reasserted. The half-framed houses stood like ribs of a carcass against the sky. He moved carefully. Instead of responding to the HOA's legal threats directly, he funneled everything through the channels he had already established. The base legal office forwarded copies of each letter to the Regional Command's Council. County investigators quietly opened a file on the board's activities. A journalist who had covered his deployment overseas received an anonymous packet of documents outlining the timeline of the land sale. Within weeks, the first story ran. It wasn't splashy, just a column in the local paper. Questions raised over subdivision land deal. It quoted public records and county officials, not him. But it was enough. Online forums picked it up. Former HOA members started emailing reporters with their own complaints. The neat facade the board had built over the years began to crack. As the narrative shifted, the board's tactics turned desperate. They held press conferences on the sidewalk outside the subdivision, flanked by half-built houses and wilting banners, claiming they were the true victims. But when reporters asked to see the deeds, the minutes, the notices, their answers faltered. Screenshots of their internal emails surfaced, showing how they had plotted to absorb his property during his absence. Even sympathetic officials backed away. Through it all, he stayed silent. He didn't appear on camera or issue statements. The story built itself from documents, not from his face or voice. At night in his quarters, he watched the coverage unfold with a detached calm. This wasn't about humiliating them personally. It was about making sure their methods were exposed so no one else would be targeted the way he had been. By late summer, the subdivision was a ghost of its own ambition. Buyers had demanded refunds. Contractors had pulled out. The board's legal fund had evaporated under mounting bills. 2 members resigned quietly, citing personal reasons. The president, once so vocal, disappeared from public view. In September, a county grand jury announced it would review the HOA's conduct regarding the land transfer. The announcement was just a paragraph in the newspaper, but it sent ripples through the neighborhood. Residents who had once voted unanimously for the board now distanced themselves, telling reporters they had been misled. Some even reached out to him privately, apologizing for their silence during the takeover. He accepted none of it personally. The years in uniform had trained him to see campaigns as sequences of objectives, not personal dramas. The repossession had been the first objective. Exposure was the second. Now a third began to form: restoration. Not just of his land, but of a principle. That service to one's country should not make a person vulnerable to exploitation at home. One crisp morning, he walked the perimeter of the field where his house had once stood. The sun rose over the silent frames of half-built homes. Grass had begun to creep back over the graded soil. He could almost see the outline of his old driveway under the new growth. It would take time, but he would rebuild. This time on terms no HOA could touch. The backlash from the board still flickered. Stray social media posts, blustery statements from a new lawyer. But the momentum was gone. Federal interest in the land had been reaffirmed, and county prosecutors were circling. The narrative had shifted irreversibly. He turned away from the empty lots and walked back to his truck. Phase 3 of his plan was complete. The board had lost the land and, more importantly, the story. The next phase would be about closure, reclaiming his property formally and ensuring the HOA's dissolution left a record others could learn from. Autumn settled over the empty subdivision like a verdict. Where there had been noise, banners, and construction dust, there was now only wind rattling through exposed studs and paper notices curling on plywood walls. Months of federal presence had ended with a quiet exodus of crews, survey stakes, and temporary fencing. What remained was a scar, but a scar under his control, not theirs. The paperwork of restoration moved as slowly as winter sunlight. Federal agencies finalized their reports. County offices logged their findings. Title examiners traced each fraudulent step the board had taken, documenting how votes had been held without quorum, how notices had been deliberately misdirected, how signatures had been forged. Each discovery added another layer to the official record. He didn't have to make speeches. The evidence spoke louder than any press conference. On base, his evenings were no longer spent plotting but signing. Deed transfers, affidavits, reclamation forms, dry language that represented the return of something real. The reactivated easement was narrowed to its original footprint. The surrounding land, once his, was deeded back to him under an agreement that made it immune to any HOA jurisdiction. A single certified envelope arrived one cold morning, thick with stamped pages. Inside lay the new deed, his name in bold above a clean legal description of the property. After months of maneuver, it was back. He drove out that evening to stand on the soil with the document in his pocket. The oak tree was still gone, the house reduced to a footprint of cracked concrete, but the air felt lighter. Children's bikes lay abandoned near the silent frames of houses. No banners hung from fences. The board's trailer had been hauled away. What remained was a blank slate under a pale autumn sky. Behind the scenes, the HOA's dissolution was underway. State regulators had suspended its corporate status. The county had placed liens on its accounts to recover unpaid fines. The bonding company, facing claims from defrauded buyers, had joined the suits against the board. One by one, the directors resigned, their names removed from the association's website. What had once been a body capable of seizing a soldier's land was now a stack of closed files in a courthouse basement. He didn't linger on their downfall. Instead, he turned his attention to rebuilding. Blueprints spread across his kitchen table. Modest, efficient plans for a new home set back from the road, framed by young saplings he would plant himself. This time there would be no HOA, no bylaws, no mandatory fees. The mailbox would stand where he chose to put it. The driveway would follow his own curve, not a developer's grid. Local media continued to cover the story. Headlines shifted from federal training on suburban land to veteran reclaims property after HOA overreach, to state investigators probe homeowners association. None of the articles named him as a source, yet his quiet persistence shaped every line. Neighbors who had once signed petitions against him now sent notes of apology. Some offered to help clear debris from the lot. He accepted a few offers not out of spite but out of a desire to move forward. Winter came early. Snow dusted the empty frames of the unfinished houses and softened the raw earth. From a distance, the subdivision looked less like a battlefield and more like a blank page. He spent weekends hauling away remnants of the old house, burning scrap wood, staking out the footprint of the new. The rhythm was slower than any operation he had run on deployment, but no less deliberate. Each act of clearing and measuring was a reclaiming, a rewriting of the story. At night, in the small rental where he stayed during construction, he read through the final reports. County prosecutors had filed charges against 2 board members for fraud. Civil suits were stacking up from buyers who had lost deposits. State legislators proposed a bill to tighten oversight of homeowners associations, citing his case as a cautionary example. What had started as a personal fight was rippling outward into policy. Yet for all the public fallout, his focus remained on the quiet details. A foundation poured level, a young tree planted straight, a mailbox painted the same color as before. The new house rose slowly through winter, its frame catching the pale sunlight like a promise. It wasn't about erasing what had happened. It was about building something stronger on top of it. By early spring, the shell of the new home stood complete. The grass around it began to green. On a cool morning, he walked the perimeter one last time before the crew arrived to hang drywall. The land under his boots felt firm again, his by law, by deed, by patience. Beyond the edge of his property, the rest of the subdivision lay in limbo, its future uncertain. But within his boundary, there was clarity. The restoration was almost complete. The final chapter would not be about fighting or even building. It would be about closure, drawing a line under the whole ordeal and stepping fully into a life beyond it. Spring bled into summer with a gentleness he hadn't felt in years. The last nails went into the siding of the new house. The walls were painted, the roof sealed, the driveway poured. Fresh sod rolled out over the soil where survey stakes and bulldozers had once stood. Young saplings lined the boundary, their thin trunks staked upright against the wind. Each detail was chosen, placed, and paid for without a board's approval, without a committee's vote. It was his again, fully and finally. Beyond his fence, the subdivision remained a skeleton. Half-built houses sagged under sun and rain. For sale signs came down. Weeds broke through the once-perfect grading. With the board dissolved and the developer gone, no one maintained the common areas. What had been a triumph of expansion now looked like an abandoned set, a warning to anyone who passed by. The paperwork of finality arrived in 2 envelopes. The first was a county certificate formally voiding the transfer and closing the case. The second was a thin letter from the state attorney's office announcing the conclusion of its investigation. 2 former board members indicted on charges of fraud and forgery. The association permanently dissolved and barred from reinstatement. There would be civil suits for years, but the core was finished. The land was his. The HOA was gone. He did not celebrate publicly. On a quiet Saturday morning, he simply took the new deed out to the edge of his property and placed a small stone marker where the oak tree had once stood. It wasn't a monument, just a point of reference, a way of saying the story ended here. Birds moved through the new saplings. The air smelled of cut grass and fresh paint, not asphalt and dust. Neighbors who had stayed on came by in small groups, bringing casseroles, tools, or just apologies. He accepted their help where it made sense, but did not dwell on the past. His fight had never been about punishing them. It had been about drawing a line, enforcing it, and showing that service did not equal vulnerability. The media's attention faded. Headlines moved on to other stories. But in legislative hearings and community forums, his case continued to be cited. Draft bills circulated proposing stricter notification requirements and clearer limits on HOA powers. Without speaking on camera, he had helped draw a map for others to follow. By late summer, his new home was finished. At dawn, light streamed through windows that faced the field where the subdivision had begun to rot. He brewed coffee in a kitchen built exactly as he'd designed it, then stepped out onto the porch and watched the sun rise over his own land. The mailbox at the end of the drive bore his name again, painted in the same color he'd used years before. Standing there, he let the weight of the past 2 years settle. The deployment, the return, the loss, the slow, patient counter-move, the repossession, the exposure, the rebuild, each had been its own campaign. Now they were chapters closed. The ground under his boots was solid. The horizon was clear. He knew the scars would remain. The oak tree would never grow back as it had been. The subdivision would take years to recover if it ever did. But he had turned a story of exploitation into one of endurance. And that, he thought, was enough. Inside, the phone buzzed with a new email, another veteran asking for advice about a homeowners association dispute. He smiled faintly, set the phone aside, and walked out into the yard. The saplings rustled in the wind, their leaves catching the morning sun. The house stood steady behind him, a quiet proof that even in the middle of bureaucracy, patience and principle could reclaim what was lost. The campaign was over. Home had been restored. And that wraps up today's story of how a single homeowner turned the tables on a powerful HOA. If you enjoyed following this journey and want to hear more unbelievable real-life property and neighborhood dramas, make sure you hit the subscribe button, tap the bell so you don't miss the next upload, and give this video a thumbs up. Sharing it with friends really helps the channel grow and lets me keep bringing you stories like this one. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.